So tonight we're looking at lessons 98. What I said this morning was we're going to combine 98 and 99, but then whenever I looked at 100, I realized I might as well throw it in there too, because we already covered most of it earlier this morning with the sermon. So it's all coming from Matthew 24, except for the first little bit of chapter 25. So the end of the age and the second coming is our main subject for tonight's lesson. So Matthew 24 is a good place to turn, although it also is covered in Mark 13 as well as Luke 21. So we will flip a little bit between those different accounts. Luke 21 is definitely going to be play an important role as we try to unravel in the short time that we have Matthew 24. And remember, just very quickly, this is coming after Jesus' last public sermon, or what we're taking to be his last public sermon. And that's where John chapter 12 says, verse 36, these things Jesus spoke, and he went away and hid himself from them. Now he's leaving the temple for the last time, never to return. So it's kind of a sad moment, especially based on what Jesus is getting ready to say about the temple. And the first three verses of Matthew 24 put it into context for us. And Matthew 24 is one of my favorite chapters to study and teach from, I guess, because there's so much confusion around it. It's based on a lot of people that you might hear talk about the Bible and spiritual things or biblical things. You would think Matthew 24 is one of only 3 or 4 chapters in the whole Bible because it comes up so much. It's like that. It's all there is. So it's very important for us to understand what Jesus is saying and what he's not saying just as important. So let's look at the first 3 verses of Matthew 24 to get the scene painted for us. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Okay, here's the scene we have. Jesus with his disciples leaving the temple. And then they start to go, walk up the Mount of Olives, headed back the way they were used to going when they would leave Jerusalem. Now, another little tidbit of information that's not given in the text is that, any of the models of the temple that you might see, and I've shown some before, of what the temple looked like in Jesus' day, is called Herod's temple, because Herod the Great, built it. He didn't build it, but he, under his what's the word I'm looking for? Administration, he got all these extravagant additions to the temple, built it up, and it was still being built up, even though he was gone. I mean, the work continued on. And so they got to a certain point where the temple came back into view, or they could, get a good view of it. And they're apparently sort of marveling at it. They're looking at it, and whether they did that before they got up the road or after they got up the road, they're sort of admiring it openly and verbally, it seems, to the point that Jesus felt compelled to say something, to sort of give a prophecy. And that prophecy was, To paraphrase, this thing's going down. That's as short as I can make it. Not going to be left. Not one stone upon another will be left. Well, that shocked them. That took them by surprise. They didn't know what to think of that. That's a big deal to a Jew. It'd be a big deal anyway to, this beautiful, huge structure, compared to a person anyway, huge structure, going to be thrown to the ground. And especially to a Jew, because this was God's house. It meant so much to them. So they were disturbed, but apparently didn't say anything yet. But later, I guess when they sat down for a little rest, they came and asked him about it. And here's one of the most important things for us to keep in mind with regard to Matthew 24, is that they asked 3 different questions, whether they realized it or not. I still haven't decided if I consider it 2 or 3 questions, so sometimes I just call it 2.5 because it's kind of like 2.5 questions, but it's certainly not one question. It's not a question about one event. They viewed it that way, clearly, but what they didn't understand was they did ask about more than one event. It's been my observation that most of the confusion about Matthew 24 is based on a failure to understand that simple fact, that the questions were about separate events, and therefore Jesus' answer is about separate events. And we're going to point that out when we get there. But notice, question number 1, when will these things be? That's a very important phrase in this chapter. These things. When will these things be? Now, in the context, what are these things? What is that? All right, what he just said, what that thing he just said, or earlier said about the temple. When will this happen? Number 2, what will be the sign of your coming? We have to understand what the significance of that in order to make sense of that. But I'll just go ahead and say we could put that down as what will be the sign of these things. They would have viewed that as a coming of the Lord. When we hear about the Lord's coming, we always think about one thing, don't we? It's the second coming. But that's not what they were talking about. They couldn't even get their head wrapped around the fact that he was leaving in the first place. So they're not even ready to think about his second coming yet. The question number 3 is, what will be the sign of the end of the age? So 3 different questions. Yep.
Wasn't the temple the symbol of the Jewish nation? And did it house the lineage of the Jews?
It seems that it did, yeah,
Well,
and to some extent at least.
see, that's how you know who the Christ is. That's why Matthew spent so much time saying where he came from and his lineage.
Yeah,
If all that's gone, that would mean that rule.
yeah, it would have totally demolished the whole system.
Exactly.
Not only would it show how,
So
confirmation
you
of the
think that was
Christ. Yeah. It also was confirmation of who the priesthood would be and the Levites. So, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but that would make it impossible for Jews to even worship scripturally anymore, because they would have no sure way of, at this point, knowing how to trace it back to even know who if somebody's of the tribe of Levi or not. I'm sure they have a rebuttal to that, but it seems fairly indisputable. Okay, so 3 questions. That's the context of their questions. They didn't realize the distinction in their question. But Jesus is going to answer their question in their proper order. more or less. So that's a key. One of the keys to unlocking Matthew 24 is that they asked 3 different questions. So verse 3 is one of the keys. All right, so next, Jesus' response. This is one of the longest speeches, or whatever we want to call it, uninterrupted of Jesus we have in the New Testament. And it's the language of this first part is very apocalyptic language. What is apocalyptic language? Or apocalyptic anyway, or of any kind. What's apocalyptic mean? Okay. We kind of think of, like an apocalypse, which the word actually just means a revelation, but when we use the word apocalyptic, it's like very dramatic, we might say. It's very, like the world's coming to an end almost, but it's very, language, for instance, like the sun's going to be darkened and the moon turned to blood. That's apocalyptic language. It's poetic language in a lot of ways, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's literally what's going to happen. The sun will be darkened and the moon turned to blood. There's a prophecy, at least one place in the Old Testament where that exact expression is used, and Peter said it was fulfilled on Pentecost. That didn't happen on Pentecost, but Peter said it did. So obviously that was figured. It was not a literal thing. So I point that out just to show that those kinds of phrases and expressions can be used in a figurative, literary way. A lot of what Jesus says here is using that kind of apocalyptic language, and the Jews were very familiar with that kind of language. The book of Daniel is very apocalyptic, and for that reason, almost everybody that twists Matthew 24 throws Daniel in there with it. There are parts of Ezekiel that are apocalyptic. What's the most apocalyptic book of the Bible you can think of? Revelation. Now, they didn't know about Revelation yet, but they would understand Revelation when it was written because they understood that kind of language. And again, Revelation is always paired with Matthew 24. So we got Daniel, Matthew 24, and Revelation. And that's supposed to be the key to unlock the whole Bible in the future of all God's plan, which is all things that man made up. Literally, every single bit of it. So, Jesus' answer was like this. Beginning in verse 4. See that no one leads you astray. What an appropriate way to start what he's about to say. For many will come in my name saying, I'm the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. For this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all the nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Okay, so he says that, as our lesson calls it, non-signs. I'm not sure if I'm fully on board with that designation, but he does say, don't let anybody lead you astray. There will be many people who claim to be the Christ, and they're going to lead people astray, but don't listen to that. There's going to be wars and rumors of wars. The Romans were so dominant, compared to the Greeks before them. At least they were maybe just as dominant as the Greeks, but the Greeks didn't last very long because Alexander the Great died, and then it sort of fell apart. But the Romans were dominant like they were and had a stronghold and were very intact. And so there was this thing called the Peace of Rome that was all over the whole empire. That's why the New Testament has such a different feel than the Old Testament in a lot of ways, is because they didn't have any nations around them trying to pummel them and put them down, because Israel was under Rome now, and Rome had no competitors, no real opposition. But Jesus says there are going to be wars and rumors of wars. But then he says, natural disasters, at least to some extent, tribulations of false prophets, lawlessness. But then he also says, the gospel will be proclaimed through the whole world. Now, there's a lot of people who would say, that's why we need to get busy, because Jesus can't come back until the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world. Yeah, there's a very relevant passage, Colossians 1:23. And I guess the question would be, when was the gospel preached to was it ever preached to the whole world, and when? Paul said, Colossians 1:23, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. Now, I guess people could try to interpret that in different ways, but it seems like such a plain statement. He says the gospel been proclaimed in all creation under heaven. And that claim was made about 7 years before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. I don't think that's insignificant at all. Now, about the actual events that happen. Those are the things that he says, these things are going to happen, but don't think the end of the world's coming. And like I mentioned this morning, almost all of these things, other than the gospel being proclaimed, had already happened and been happening forever. Wars, the love of many growing cold, lawlessness, false prophets, false Christs. We don't read about any false Christs, having a big movement in the Bible, but it did happen in between the Testaments. There had been some who were claiming that, and they all died. They were all killed. Ironically, so was the real Christ, the true Christ, but a totally different situation going on there, as we know. People falling away, betraying one another, hating one another. This just sounds like the world. They'll deliver you up to tribulation, put you to death. You'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Didn't he already tell them that is going to happen? Okay, so in the interest of not running out of time, which I know we're going to do, but not running out of time just as badly as we might. Leads us to part 2. Now, obviously, most of the things that he's saying were not going to be understood by the disciples that he was telling. Probably why he said, see that no one leads you astray. And then there's also going to be a statement about letting the reader understand here in verse 15. So, Jesus, again, so far is referencing not necessarily the end of the world or the destruction of Jerusalem, but just these kinds of things are going to start happening, but the end is not yet. So don't let anybody lead you astray that it's about to happen. I would say that is still applicable today, even though the things that are happening in the world today, or as we see it, things are getting worse. I'm not so sure things are getting worse, to be honest. It's just that people say they're getting worse because they think they are for some reason, and then that sort of gives the impression that maybe it actually is getting worse. The world's always been the world. So after giving them a list of these non-signs, as our lesson calls it, he gives them the real sign. He says this, verse 15, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what's in his house. Let the one who's in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had been cut short, no human being would be saved. For the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, don't believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Thank you, Lord, for doing that. They would probably reflect later, and so should we. So if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, don't go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, don't believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather, or eagles. Okay, here's a big question for us. What is the abomination of desolation? Doesn't that sound so epic and blockbuster? The abomination of desolation. That sounds like something that one of the TV evangelists would talk about. You know why? Because they do. The abomination of desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel. Now, what is the abomination of desolation? Well, let's read first Daniel 9, 26 and 27, okay? I'll just read that. Here's what Daniel says. After the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. But what is he talking about? What's Daniel referring to? The key to the question about the abomination of desolation is Luke's account of this exact same statement. So here's what Matthew says. Matthew 24, 15 and 16. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay? Mark says, Mark 13, 14. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Pretty close, isn't it? Now, what Luke says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Well, that's a lot different. And another one of those moments where Luke, one gospel writer, interprets one of the others. So what is the abomination of desolation? When Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. We know that for a fact by a comparative analysis of the three synoptic gospels. Matthew says abomination desolation when you see the abomination of desolation. Mark says when you see the abomination of desolation. Luke says when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So that's what that is.
Is that also what he's referring to in 2 Thessalonians in the 2nd chapter when he talks about the rebellion that must come first? And
I don't think so. You're talking about the man of sin and all that. You said 2 Thessalonians 2?
unless the rebellion come first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction,
I mean,
who opposes himself and exalts himself.
I don't think they're referring to the same thing. There are some compelling arguments, a few different ones for what that's talking about.
Because by 2 Thessalonians, the temple hadn't fallen yet, had it?
I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look at the dates. I'm inclined to think 2 Thessalonians may have. It would have been pretty close, maybe, but maybe I guess before. If Paul died when it's believed he died, I think it would have to be before because.
In the Bible thing that we Thessalonians is suspected to be written about 51 AD, and the temple didn't fall until
Yeah,
70.
till 70.
So it had not come yet.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that's what he's talking about. I'd have to look into that. But, okay, so what were they to do when they saw the abomination of desolation? Okay, number one, flee to the mountains. Number two, it's pretty much all run, but flee to the mountains. That's the immediate thing he says. Let the one who's on the housetop, don't go down. Don't you try to go down and get some stuff. If you're in the field, don't run back home to get your cloak or whatever. If women who are pregnant, it's going to be bad for them. Nursing infants, it's going to be bad. Why? It's going to be harder to get places, especially quickly. Pray that it's not in winter. Same reason. Or on a Sabbath. Same reason. And this is, again, confirms that Jesus cannot be talking about His second coming. Because what good will it do anybody to flee to the mountains when that trumpet sounds when He returns? Yeah, that's what a lot of people would do. We read, pray that, I'm going to go hide in a cave somewhere and pray that the mountain falls on me so He can't find me or whatever. So what good would it do? Why would Jesus tell somebody to do that, considering it's not going to make any difference? So clearly He's talking about something that would make a difference. And again, Luke 21:20 is the key, because it reveals to us by the Holy Spirit, not somebody's opinion or some commentators who worked it out or think that they've got it all figured out. We don't have to turn to Revelation to find out. We don't even have to turn to Daniel to find out, even though he gets called out here, because Luke tells us it's when Jerusalem's surrounded by armies. And when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies, a siege began shortly thereafter, lasted about, off and on for about 3 years. And Josephus claims that many Christians in AD 70, that's the year that it happened, AD 70, understood and remembered what Jesus had said on this occasion, and they did do what He said, and they survived. They got out because when they saw Jerusalem surrounded by armies, they got out of there. But he says they killed over 1 million people. But that may be exaggerated. But they killed many, many, many thousands of people. They destroyed the city, burned it to the ground, destroyed the temple. What about verse 27, though? For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Well, you know what? We're not even going to go there. So if you know what it means, well done, but we're not going there. If we stick a foot in there, then we won't get our foot out before we run out of time, because that's about to happen already. So he tells us some events. So let's just sum up what we've looked at so far. First of all, he tells about some things that are going to happen, but not to be led astray that the end's about to come. Then he says, here's when you know these things are about to happen. When you see the abomination of desolation, which is Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Then you know that what I've just prophesied is about to happen. It's near. Now, he says in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. Hey, that sounds like something we just mentioned earlier at the beginning, doesn't it? The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Not a single one of which does he mean literally is going to happen. If that is literally going to happen, you're not going to have to look very closely to see that. First of all, if the stars start falling from heaven, and I don't even know how that would work, literally speaking, because the earth is not the center of the universe, and if a star falls from heaven, it ain't going to come anywhere near the earth because it's, however many millions of light years away from us. Clearly, this is poetic language, and I reference again the prophecy about the moon darkened, or the sun darkened and moon turned to blood, by inspiration of the Holy Spirit being fulfilled on Pentecost, and that proves that language can be used to refer to figuratively to refer to events when it didn't actually happen. The Jews wouldn't have confused that, but we are not familiar with that kind of language, so the confusion is a little bit easier. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And He will send out His angels with a loud trumpet call. They will gather His elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Then He throws in a lesson from the fig tree. 32. As soon as its branches become tender and put out its leaves, you know that summer's near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that He is near at the very gates. Now, verse 34 is the most important verse in the whole chapter of Matthew 24. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't really know exactly what to do with verses 29 through 31 and where to put it. I don't really know even exactly a foolproof explanation for verse 27. However, because of verse 34, I know that it's not talking about the end of time. Because Jesus said, everything that I've just said will happen before this generation dies. They will not pass away. They will not die. Not they'll be alive. If He said this generation will be alive when all these things take place, somebody could say, yeah, because they're going to be raised. That's why they'll be alive. Jesus doesn't say they'll be alive. He says they will not die until all these things. There's that key phrase again, these things. So question number 1 is over. Verse 35 also says, and this is important for us to understand, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. That's an expression. That doesn't mean heaven and earth is going to pass away when these things happen. That's an expression when He says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words won't. Everything I've just said, you can take it to the bank, count on it, period. He doesn't mean heaven and earth is going to pass away at that time. But He said, heaven and earth will pass away has more likelihood than my words passing away. Just like the grass withers and the flower fades, but the Word of God abides forever. That's exactly the same kind of expression. The firmness and trustworthiness of the Lord's words. Yes?
See, just like with Jeremiah, the Lord in His prophecy often foretold to His people what was going to happen. But now, and even today, we have a tendency as humans to say, like when circumstances around you change, God is trying to tell you something. And I think He's saying in this last verse, I don't care what's happening out in the world. My word will not ever pass away. Your faith, your trust, your anchor is in my word forever. And
Yeah.
don't pay any attention to what's going on. Now,
Yeah, and that was part of His word was,
that's
as I tell you beforehand, there are going to be some false Christs. Don't believe them. Or anything they say, which one thing they might be saying is, the end is near. Don't believe them. He says, all these, there's going to be earthquakes and famines and wars, and you're going to be suffering tribulation, and people are going to betray one another, hate one another. Lawlessness is going to, grow rampant, and many false prophets. Don't believe any of it. It's not a sign of the end. But when you see the abomination of desolation, when Jerusalem's surrounded by armies, then you know that these things are about to take place. And it's going to take place before this generation dies. Now the next key is verse 36. The word but is very important. And you can see how he shifts here and starts answering another question that they didn't even realize they asked. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Now, somebody might say, well, yeah, he's still talking about the same day. He says, but concerning that day, no one knows when it's going to come. Well, first of all, that doesn't work with the contrasting conjunction that the word but is. But it also makes him contradict himself immediately. He just said, here's some signs for these things, a sign at least. But then he says, there won't be any signs? No, he says, but concerning that day, in other words, that other day that you asked about, there won't be any signs. It's going to be like back in the days of Noah. What does that mean? Surely that means all the evil on the earth, because that's what the Bible says, that God saw and that man's heart was evil, only evil continually, and that's how it's going to be, just like he said, nation rising against nation, hate each other, betray one another, lawlessness. No, he says it's going to be like the days of Noah, in that people were just going about living their lives like normal, and they had no clue it was coming, the flood was coming, until it started raining. That's what he says. In those days, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. That's just a short way of saying people were just going about their daily lives, business, like nothing was going on. That's how the coming of the Son of Man will be. 2 men will be in the field. We're not going to get into that either. Therefore, stay awake, for you don't know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, and this is back to where we started this morning. It's going to be totally unannounced. Again, they asked, when will these things be? He's already dealt with that. All kinds of stuff's going to happen, but it's not going to be a sign of the end or of the destruction of Jerusalem. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that's when it's going to happen. But about that day that you talked about, that you asked, that day, there will be no signs. Nobody knows. I don't even know, he says. Isn't that something? I don't even know. Now, he may know now. Jesus might know now when he's coming back. But he says he didn't then. I don't even know. Only the Father. So don't look for anything, because there's nothing to look for. And if there's nothing to look for, and it's just going to come like that, better be ready. Always. Every day. Be ready tomorrow, be ready always, because, just like a thief. That's what it means that he's going to come like a thief in the night. That's what that means. Thief doesn't call and say, hey, I'm on my way. This would be a lot easier if you'd leave your door unlocked. Just want to let you know I'm on my way. If you'd leave the door unlocked, I wouldn't have to break the window. Just an idea. No. That homeowner might leave the door unlocked, but he's going to leave the door unlocked because he's going to be hanging out of it with a shotgun. No thief does that. So that's the way that Jesus is coming like a thief in the night, because he's not going to herald his coming. There won't be any sign before it happens. Therefore, you must be ready. Like a servant, going about his master's business, always. So that when I do come back, when the master does come back, he'll receive approval, he'll be rewarded, he'll be pleased with him. So, that's the application. And that's the parable of the 10 virgins, which is even further application. Watch, therefore, for you don't know the day or the hour. It's going to be unknown, unexpected. So you got to be prepared always. So Jesus emphatically states that he did not know when he would come. And if he didn't know, how could he give any signs? If he didn't know and couldn't give any signs, how can we try to read into various events? You know, we got the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other hand, because I can see it unfolding. Here it is. The signs, the signs. Billy Graham was a big proponent of Matthew 24's knocking at the door. The signs, all you got to do is open the newspaper and you can see that Jesus is about to return. He needed to read his own Bible a little bit more closely. Meaning no disrespect, but clearly he was not as intimate with his scriptures as many people would believe, because Jesus himself said, no signs, period. Unexpected, unknown. There would be a sign, however, concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. So clearly, Jesus answers two different questions, at least in Matthew 24. The key is, many won't be prepared. Many weren't prepared for the destruction of Jerusalem. Many more will not be prepared for his second coming. But what about you and me? We got to make sure that we are prepared and ready when Jesus comes, because it could be 1,000,000 years from now. It could also be 30 seconds from now. But if it was 30 seconds from now, it's not because, we shouldn't have been reading the signs, because there won't be any. So if you ever talk to somebody who brings that up, hopefully some of the lesson, the handout, and other things, the resources that we've been given in this study on these 3 lessons, or at least those 2 lessons, could help you to know where to go to show them those keys, the different questions. Luke 21:20, Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Especially show them verse 34, Matthew 24. All these things, this generation will not pass away till all these things are accomplished. That takes care of it all by itself. 30 seconds if anybody has a comment.
Why would he say that they pray that it not be on the Sabbath?
Because of travel restrictions. They weren't allowed to.
Shouldn't be travel restrictions by then.
Well, for many of them there wouldn't, but they may have enforced that more directly, not just in their hearts they held to it, but it may have actually been enforced in the city, where people may not have been allowed to leave the city or something like that. And we know that many of the Jewish Christians were still hanging on to a lot of the things like that, like special days and the feasts, and so that may be one of the things that they struggled to get over. Or, like I said, it could have been more heavily enforced about the traveling. But the Jews, technically, some of the people that may have heard Jesus' words, they could have been helped by Jesus' prophecies here, even if they were still adhering to Judaism, who definitely would have been holding on to the travel things. So
Some of the Jews on the campus still celebrate the holidays and the traditions, and they don't even believe in God.
I've heard that many of them don't at this point.
I don't understand this.
Well, God forsook them. And so many of them, instead of humbling themselves and turning to God, they've just decided it was all fake all along. Just imagine that being that deep. That Moses, the whole thing was a hoax all along, just because of ancestral refusal to turn to Him. But AD 70 marked the time when God said, enough, on the nation of Israel. That should have been a sign to them, a symbol that He was done with them. And it should be that same sign or symbol for us. They're never going to be His people again as a nation. If they become Christians, then they each individually will be his people, but that's the only way. There will never be a time when Israel will turn to him as a nation and get him to turn back to them. The only way for them to be God's people again is to become Christians by accepting Jesus as the Messiah and obeying the gospel like everybody else.